35 minutes.
Right.
Hi, welcome. My name is Anish Karnataka. I work for Oracle and also the OSGi board as a program committee for this conference. I'll be the moderator for this room today. We have Graham Charters, who is going to talk to us on the 4 component models, DS, DP, JB, CDI, what the F. He's going to tackle that for us. I've known him for a while. I knew him when we were working on the service component architecture way back when. And I should note that 2 years ago at the OSGi community event, he gave a keynote called Modularity Maturity Model. Very insightful. It was one of the best talks I've attended on OSGi, and I'm sure this one would be very similar. All right, so I've raised the stakes.
Yeah, thank you.
Graham is a senior technical staff member at IBM, and he works on the WebSphere application server dev organization. Is responsible for OSGi applications, feature of the app server, and is also a committer and PMC member of Apache Air's OSGi programming model project. He's also the IBM technical lead in the OSGi Alliance EEG. And so Ram, over to you.
Thank you, Anish. So the talk I've got today, this actually came out of a discussion at the end of the last Eclipse community event. I was walking back to the station with Mike Francis. He's not here. So if this ends up being not a particularly interesting talk, it's Mike Francis's fault, not mine. So we were having a discussion, and he was saying there's some confusion around kind of which component model's best. Do I use Declarative Services? Do I use Blueprint? What about all these other component models? Why are we creating all these things? And so I thought it'd be a good idea to maybe put together a presentation describing each of the component models. So I'll start by giving a bit of a background to why we are in this position, why we have these component models available in OSGi, why we're actually enabling even more for OSGi. I'll talk a bit about the criteria I use to compare them. Some of these are technical criteria, so the capabilities of the component models. Some of them are criteria that might be kind of specific to your particular business. So talking about the background to your company, what skills you have, what assets you have. I'll describe the 4 component models and how they measure up against those different criteria. And also then summarize with a kind of set of questions to ask yourself when making a choice as to which component model to use to help you decide which one would be best for you. Okay, so why did we end up where we are today, and why are we kind of continuing on down this path? Well, if you kind of take a step back and look at back in time, and when OSGi didn't have an enterprise expert group and it was focused on sort of the embedded space, or was being used by typically middleware vendors to build systems, around that time, component models were being created in the kind of Java SE space. Things like Spring, Dependency Injection was becoming very popular. So OSGi created its own component model because it needed to address some consumability or usability needs that kind of raw OSGi in the absence of things like Declarative Services has. We then created the Enterprise Expert Group, which is actually, I have no idea, it's probably getting on for about 4 or 5 years old now. 6, is it? Wow. Oh, God. I don't stay in jobs longer than 3 years. Something's gone wrong here. We created the Enterprise Expert Group, and of course it had its own set of baggage, in a good way. So existing component models that were being used in the enterprise space around Java EE. And so there was a push, and there is a continued push to standardize and describe how those component models can work in OSGi in a first-class way. So how existing things like EJB or CDI can make use of OSGi modularity and service layer. And so that's kind of a very short summary of why we're kind of going down this path. Okay, so to the comparison approach. So I'll describe, the next couple of slides describe the criteria that I use, technical and non-technical, for comparing the component models. I'll have a one-slide summary. So if you're expecting in-depth on Blueprint or Declarative Services or EJB or CDI, you're going to be sorely disappointed, and I'm sorry, and you can leave now if you like. I'll then describe as part of that slide how each one rates against those criteria. And as I've mentioned, the reasons aren't always technical, and I can pretty much guarantee we won't all agree on what I say, and that's fine. And actually, when I did this talk at EclipseCon US about 6 months ago, or whatever it is, in the OSGi DevCon track, and got some feedback, learnt from my mistakes, and hopefully this one is a bit of an improved presentation. And if I find from the feedback that it's not, then I'll go and do something else next time. Okay, so technical criteria. Sorry, extra bean and intra bean sounds really pompous, and I maybe should have come up with a different name for it. But so the first two bullets are really around the approach that the component model takes so they're all typically based around some concept of a bean, very close to a Java bean, for example. And then they add ways of describing extra characteristics of those components. And extra bean means, do they use a separate side file to describe that information? So, for example, Declarative Services using an XML side file. Intra bean means, do you actually do all the extra configuration inside your bean? And there are pros and cons to each. People like using annotations, for example, because it's nice and it's there with your code, and it kind of makes it simple in terms of management capability. However, if you want to reconfigure it, you need to recompile, whereas if you're using XML, you can just modify it outside and your bean can stay the same. And you can also actually potentially use that bean in different component models, so you can configure it using Blueprint or configure it using Declarative Services, for example. Extensibility, is there anything in a standard way that describes how to extend the component model? Because the standards will cover a certain set of capabilities, but you might want more, in which case is there a formal way to actually extend that component model? Do they support enterprise quality as a service? Because we can use simple beans for wiring together and building business logic, but if you then want to deploy that or use that in an environment where you need transactional capabilities, or you need security, or you need persistence, does the component model describe how to integrate those things in? And then finally, quality of integration with OSGi. So how well does it actually integrate with the OSGi technologies? Okay, non-technical criteria. So you might care about open standards. You don't want to lock yourself into one particular vendor or into one particular open source project necessarily. Open source implementations. It might be that your company has a policy of only using open source or preferring open source. So are there open source implementations out there of the technologies? If so, are there multiple implementations, which actually gives you further choice? Which gets me on to the next one, choice of implementations. So even irrespective of whether there are open source implementations, if the standards, are there multiple vendors implementing those standards, in which case you may prefer that because then that gives you vendor choice. Availability of tools. So it's one thing to have a programming model, but how easy is it to actually develop to that programming model? Are there good tools that help you do that development? Existing assets. So this kind of comes back to your particular circumstances within your company. Does your company have existing assets and they're looking to start using those in an OSGi environment? Or does your company have existing skills, in which case you might want to choose a component model that plays to those skills rather than having to switch to something completely new and learn all the details of that new component model. All right, so when I started trying to come up with a list of component models, and there are a number that are missed off here, like iPojo or Spring, for example. I wanted to focus on the ones that I'd heard about most, and also the ones where there's most activity around open standards. So these are the four I came up with: are Declarative Services, which is typically known as DS, Blueprint, which actually isn't known as BP, but it actually makes for a better title, EJB, so Enterprise JavaBeans, Context and Dependency Injection, so CDI, and just so I don't get into trouble with my employer, WTF actually stands for World Taekwondo Federation. Okay, so when I did this presentation 6 months ago, some of the feedback I got, and actually the feeling I got as I was presenting it, because I didn't quite appreciate it until I was going through it, was just going through 4 slides showing the different component models is a bit dry and a bit boring. The feedback was good, but so I've learned from this. So I put in the abstract that I'd show some demos, and then realized last week I didn't have any demos, so I spent last week frantically trying to put them together. They all work. One of them's a little bit flaky, but hopefully it'll be fine. So yes, I now have demos. And so the demo it's very, very basic, but hopefully it shows just some of the kind of the initial capabilities of the various component models. So the main focus of the demo is this thing in the middle. So what I wanted to be able to show with each of the component models is how you consume a service using the component model and how you provide a service using the component model. So I'm using the component model to create a servlet component that's implementing the HTTP servlet interface. And it's going to consume a time service, which is just going to give it a string. It's actually a date time, so it's just giving you a formatted date time string. And then it's going to register a service, which is implementing the JavaX servlet interface, or providing the JavaX servlet interface. And it's registering it with a service property. Who here is familiar with the HTTP service? Okay, that's pretty good, about a third of the room. So what I'm using here is the HTTP service, but rather than, because I wanted to show providing a service, who here has used the Felix implementation with the whiteboard pattern? Okay, all right. So the HTTP service, have I got time to go into this? Probably. The HTTP service, the version that's standardized today, what that does is it registers a service, which is this thing represented here. And then if you want to use that HTTP service to register servlets with it, this component would typically track that service. And once that service appears, it can go and register its servlets with it. The pain about that is that this component has to then depend on the HTTP service. So it's not much of a kind of inversion of a control pattern, if you see what I mean. So what Apache Felix has done, and what's coming in the next rev of the HTTP service specification, is adapt the HTTP service to support what's called the whiteboard pattern. So the whiteboard pattern in OSGi is essentially there's something looking for a particular type of service in the OSGi service registry, and when it finds that service, it goes and does something on your behalf. So in this example, there is a whiteboard bundle, which is independent of the HTTP service implementation, which sits there looking for HTTP service, sits there looking for JavaX servlet services, and when it finds them, it goes and registers them with the HTTP service. So that makes writing this component a lot simpler. So now I can consume my date time service, and I can register a servlet service, and that will just get added by the whiteboard into the HTTP service, and I can go and then point my browser at it. And so what this is a little bit of configuration to this whiteboard pattern that says this is where the context root is of this particular servlet that I'm registering. Okay. So you've got to remember that when I get onto the demo. So the first component model, Declarative Services. As I mentioned at the start, in the kind of why we are here, Declarative Services was created kind of pre-Enterprise Expert Group. It was inspired by the popularity of dependency injection frameworks that was growing around that time. And if you've ever done kind of raw service programming in OSGi, it can be a bit hairy and a bit complicated. And so Declarative Services was created as a dependency injection mechanism to make it easier for you to work with the OSGi service layer. And so this was actually the first component model, other than bundles themselves, because you can think of those as a component model, but the first kind of bean-based component model in OSGi. In its first incarnation, and for a while, it focused purely on an XML-based model for describing the components and their interactions. So here's an example here with this is the implementation bean. It's providing a service under this interface, and it's going to consume a log service, and that's essentially what this XML means. Then around, I think it was OSGi 4.3, it added support for annotations. These are build time annotations, so you can, this Java here is equivalent to this XML here, except it's also got the Bean implementation, or at least the interface. So at component basically says this is a DS declarative service component that's going to provide an implementation of this service interface, and then this is the reference using the annotation. Extensibility, you can extend DS schema-wise, so it's got the XML schema for declarative services is littered with any elements and any attributes, so you can add things in an alternative namespace. And it also has an attribute at the component level that says you can say whether a processor of this XML must understand any extensions, and if it doesn't understand those, then it should fail processing that component. Enterprise quality as a service, there's nothing, I've not come across any places where people have extended declarative services to add things like transactions or security or persistence support. In terms of quality of OSGi integration, this was designed by OSGi experts from the ground up. Of all the component models, it's probably the one with the best integration with OSGi. Its standards, it's purely an OSGi Alliance standard. Implementations, there are implementations in Eclipse Equinox and Apache Felix. I forget which one I'm using in my demo. I actually tried both and they both work perfectly fine. The Eclipse Equinox one, I believe, is the reference implementation. Tools-wise, because these are build time annotations, you need something that's going to understand them and generate the XML, so that's BND or BND tools will do that for you. So, time for a quick demo. All right, so this is I haven't used the annotation support, so this is a declarative service XML for my servlet. So I've got an implementation bean called DS servlet. I have an interface. It's going to register a service under the JavaBeans register service under the JavaBeans servlet interface, and it's got a dependency on the time service. And when the time service is available, it's going to call the set time service method to do the injection. Okay, so I'll just quickly show you the time service. Go away. So the time service was just, that's the interface. This is me registering the service just programmatically. And the implementation is just essentially returning a string format of the date and time. Okay, so now onto the relevant bit. So for declarative services, you put in the manifest header an opt-in that says, this says I'm going to use declarative services, and this is where you find the XML file. And then I've shown you the declarative services XML file. And then the implementation is pretty simple. So it's an HTTP servlet. It has a set time service method for the injection, and I've only implemented the do-get. So all I do is return the class name, so we know that it's the right implementation, and then I return the time. And so I'm using something PDE based, so I've got a configuration. And so we started this, and if I have a look, if we do, oops. We can see there are a number of servlets registered. Here's the one, most of them are kind of infrastructure things like Felix Web Console, but here's the one that's been registered by Declarative Services, and it's been registered with the alias, so that will be available at /ds. So if I then go, there we go. Okay, in terms of the runtime I built up, this was just taking various open source components. The beauty of OSGi is it's kind of nice mix and match. So I'm using Eclipse Equinox, I'm using the Felix DS implementation. The Equinox one worked perfectly fine. It's using Jetty and so on. Okay, so I'll just start my next workspace opening. Okay, so that's DS. Blueprint. So Blueprint was the first, in fact it's the only component model at the moment that's been fully standardized by the Enterprise Expert Group. EJB and CDI, which are the next two, are in the pipeline. This was inspired by Spring and Spring DM. So Spring DM was a project that I think was a kind of collaboration between sort of BEA, Oracle and Spring Source, which was designed to take Spring, as the Spring component model, and describe how to integrate, so register Spring Beans in the OSGi service registry and describe how dependencies from Spring Beans can be satisfied by services in the OSGi service registry, and then how to package that all up in an OSGi bundle and deploy that. It was standardized by Spring Source in R4.2, I think, which was the first enterprise spec. First time we had an enterprise specification. It takes the extra bean approach, so it's all XML based. There are annotations available in the Apache Aries project. They're not standard. In terms of extensibility, it describes how to extend Blueprint through namespaces. So again, it's got any elements and any attributes littered throughout the schema, so it's extensible, and then describes that any Blueprint implementation's got to understand those extensions or fail. In terms of the implementations, I know Apache Aries has then kind of SPIs or internal APIs for extending it to write what it calls namespace handlers. And that's actually been used a lot. It's been used by IBM to add transactions and security and JPA support to the Web3 application server. It's been used by Apache Aries to add transactions support. And it's been used heavily by other Apache projects like Service Mix and CXF and Camel. OSGi integration. There are some. Did anyone go to the lightning talks last night? Don't be shy. Okay, about 5 of you. So Tim Ward talked about when are things really optional and about some of the issues around optionality, and talked about some of the lifecycle issues in Blueprint and how we're addressing them in an update to the Blueprint spec. So there is a Blueprint 1.1 in the pipeline. So what Blueprint tries to do is actually cushion you from some of the dynamics of the OSGi service registry. So it will proxy dependencies on services so that you don't end up with nulls if something's not there. The downside is it got some of the timeouts. The defaults for the timeouts are a little bit wrong, which makes it a little bit nasty. But those are being improved in the 1.1 specification. In terms of standards, although it's inspired by Spring, it's complete OSGi Alliance standard. Implementations, there's an implementation in Eclipse Gemini, which is the reference implementation, and there's an implementation in Apache Aries. In terms of tools, there's support for developing Blueprint in the no charge or free WebSphere developer tools and in the rational application developer tools. But I don't think there are any kind of pure open source tools for doing Blueprint development. So this is just an example of the Blueprint. So it looks similar to Declarative Services. It's a little bit more verbose because it's actually a little bit more flexible in the sense that you can actually wire beans together, and you can have multiple things wiring to a single dependency on a service. So it's got extra flexibility, but with that extra flexibility comes a cost, which is it's slightly more verbose than Declarative Services. So here we've got a bean implementation that's actually got a dependency on a log service, and it's registering a discount calculator service. All right, demo time. I should have said earlier that when I did this 6 months ago, it filled a 35-minute slot, and I've since added demos, so I'm going to try and go a bit quicker. So we got the time service. It's exactly the same time service. Blueprint-wise, so Blueprint has a header. Oops. In the manifest called bundle blueprint, which identifies where the XML is. And here's the blueprint declaration for this particular example. So we've got the servlet bean, which has a dependency on the time service, and it's registering under the Java servlet interface with an alias of /blueprint. And then if we look at the bean, it's, in fact, I don't think there's actually any significant difference between this and, other than the comments in the code, between this and the DS bean. So this is the kind of point I was making about if the configuration is outside the bean, you could actually configure the same bean implementation through different technologies depending on which one you want to use. So this is doing exactly the same thing, just going to write out the class name and the time. Okay. Whoop, didn't want to do that there. So if we should be able to see if I scroll up. Have I missed it? It's the bottom, was it? Typical. Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because I was looking for the alias further over here. So this is the service registered, and we can see that the whiteboard bundle is using it. So hopefully it's been registered with a HTTP service, and it's going to be available under /blueprint. So if I now change this to, yeah, there we go. And if we look at the implementation, this is actually, again, a mixture of various projects. It's got Equinox, it's got Apache Aries for the blueprint implementation, it's got Felix stuff, and so on. Okay. Next. So I'm going to have to go quick, aren't I? All right, EJB. I'm going to rattle through this one, I'm afraid, and the next one. So EJB, it's actually, so when I did this 6 months ago, EJB was 15 years old that week, so it's now 15 and a half years old. So we're soon going to have people in the room who weren't alive when, when EJB was first created. It started out using an XML approach. It was kind of its time in terms of designs. It kind of evolved out of the Corba world and was using interfaces and inheritance and so on. And so as the kind of state of the art evolved, EJB got a bit of a bad name. I actually quite like EJB now. Once we got to EJB 3, it's actually quite a nice compact component model. So here we've got a stateless session being this in the EJB programming model will get registered under that interface as a service in the service registry, and you can do things like this with the app resource annotation to look up services and have them injected from the service registry. Extensibility, it doesn't have anything formal in terms of how to extend EJB, but when you combine EJB with CDI and CDI's extensibility, then I think you can extend EJB through those means. Enterprise quality of service, this is probably the best component model there is in terms of providing enterprise quality of service. It's got standard transactions, security, remoting, persistence, messaging, and so on. So you can use message-driven beans for inbound asynchronous workloads. OSGi integration, core capability. I'm not sure what I meant by that, but essentially there are implementations of EJB and OSGi. That's what I meant. And they typically only support the kind of core OSGi capabilities. There's no integration with configuration admin, for example, or event admin, or those kinds of things. Standards, of course, the component model itself is standardized in the JCP. The OSGi integration is in the process of being standardized in the OSGi Alliance. Unfortunately, it has, a bus factor of 1, and the person who's driving that spec is now on maternity leave, so it's slowed down a bit, unfortunately. Implementations, there are various implementations, some in open source, some in proprietary products. Tools, again, we have support in the WebSphere developer tools, and that's what I've got here. So I'm going to quickly do the EJB demo. Okay, so one of the issues with EJB is EJB, when you register an EJB, doesn't actually give you the ability to register a service, a property, sorry. So this is my EJB servlet that's going to be registered in the service registry, and it will register with the service property of EJB.name, but that's not going to be used by the whiteboard pattern to register it with the HTTP service. So what I had to do is write this little adapter bundle, which basically, and excuse my code because it's not robust, it's just doing the bare minimum. It's going to be injected with the servlet service, and then it's going to re-register it with the appropriate alias, so it gets picked up by the HTTP service. So I've got this little extra bundle in there. Okay, I think that's about it. There's a header called export EJB, which tells the runtime that the bundle contains EJBs. So let's run this one. Okay. And we can see this is the one that the adapter has registered. This is the one that the EJB runtime registered. And this is being used by the HTTP service, so I can now look this up at EJB servlet, and there we go. This runtime was quite a lot harder to craft. It's got 76 bundles. The previous ones had about 30. I'm not sure whether they're all required. I actually cheated with this one, and I took the definition of a runtime that was used to fire up an iTest in Apache Aries and just put all those bundles in because I knew they worked. Final one, CDI. Okay, so I'm down to 4.5 minutes. Let's see how we go. Okay, CDI. This is a relative newcomer, both, I guess, in the in the JCP, but also from an OSGi perspective. So it's got its DNA in the JCP process from JBoss Seam, Google Juice, and Spring. I've never seen a component model be so maniacally focused on using annotations. So it's very much an intrabean component model, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The Beans XML, I think, is gradually becoming less and less used in CDI. That's kind of an opt-in. I think in 1.1 it became even optional, I think, the Beans XML. Extensibility, it has good extensibility mechanisms. It's got the concept of interceptors, which are kind of application level generic ways to extend CDI. Decorators, which are kind of, I think, component specific ways of kind of extending particular component types. And then portable extensions, which to my mind are more of a kind of middleware-y way of extending a CDI runtime. Enterprise quality as a service, it doesn't talk about enterprise quality as a service, but what CDI does do, which is quite interesting, is it lets you can mix CDI with existing component models. So you can use CDI injection in EJBs or in other component models. So really the combination of EJB and CDI give you the quality of service capabilities. OSGi integration, the core capabilities are available in open source, though that's improving over time. Standards, JCP and OSGi Alliance, implementations as the Weld OSGi project, there's PAX CDI, which I think supports Open WebBeans and Weld as CDI implementations. Something called Fighterfish, which I think is a Glassfish project, although I don't know much about that one. And then tools. Wasn't sure about this. I just put EE vendor tools down. I'm not sure how much tool support you need because it's just annotations, and as long as your Java environment knows about the annotations, it can do everything you need. So here's an example. So the app component and app service are the extensions for OSGi. So this is a DS component that's going to be registered in the service registry because of the app component annotation, and this injection point. This app service says I want to actually be injected by a service from the service registry, and it actually uses proxying. So rather than, but there are lifecycle methods if you want to be aware of when you're getting re-injected. Okay, 2 minutes. All right, so this is an early version, based on an early version of the CDI reference implementation, which is slated to be packed CDI. So I'm registering the component. I'm saying what in the service registry, I'm saying what interface it wants to be registered under, and this nice thing, it's a little bit verbose, but it actually gives me the ability to register with service properties, so I can put the alias in. And here I'm saying I want the time service to be injected from the service registry, and then the implementation is just as it was before. It's got an opt-in header. This is actually using the require capability header in the OSGi Alliance. All of these component models over time are going to add this require capability in. It actually gives you the ability to use the resolver to ensure that when you've deployed one of these bundles, that you have something that's going to provide that capability in the runtime. So that's just a kind of something that's going to come along over time. So let me fire this one up quickly. Got 30 seconds. And I've got one more slide. Oops. Okay. Maybe I should just do that. So yeah, there's the servlet registered under /CDI. There we go. And there's about 35 bundles in that one, and that's got a mixture of packs and JavaBeans and a few other things. That's my time up. So, all right. So, quickly, questions to ask yourself. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of the various component models and a bit about the motivation. If you're looking to start writing applications in OSGi and you're wondering which component model to use, so ask yourself, what are the existing skills I've got in my team? For example, if you're using Spring, then you might want to use Blueprint because its heritage is in the Spring component model. What existing assets do I have? If you've got EJBs, it doesn't seem, and you've got lots of these EJBs, it doesn't seem to make sense to then go and start using another component model just for the sake of adopting OSGi. Do I need enterprise quality of service? If you do, then consider using Blueprint and EJB because those both support that. If you don't, then DS is a good component model to choose because it's got first-class OSGi integration. Do I want something based on standards? If you do, then I've given you the kind of state-of-the-art today, standards-wise, but these things are forever evolving, so you should kind of familiarize yourself with what the current state is. Do I need something based on open source? There are a myriad of open source projects implementing the various component models, so you can go and look at all of those, look at how active the communities are and so on, and then take your pick. What are the capabilities of my target runtime? It might be that your company has a corporate standard for the runtime you use. There's no point in going and choosing a component model which isn't available on that runtime. What are the capabilities of my tool chain? So what tools am I using? So what tools do I have today? What do they have in terms of support for the component models? And this goes beyond development tools. It also includes things like build, for example, and if you're doing continuous delivery, what are the kind of operational capabilities? And what if I use more than one component model? Well, this I think is where OSGi really comes into its own, because each of these component models you saw registered services and used services in exactly the same way on the outside. And so you can deploy bundles with different component models as part of the same application, and it doesn't matter, because outside the bundle, nobody knows or nobody cares which component model you happen to use. Okay, so I guess the one short summary would be, I don't believe there's one component model to rule them all, so you just need to kind of navigate your way through these questions to make your decision.
Thank you, Graham. I don't think we have time for questions, but
I'll be around, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be around, so if you have questions, you ask him. Thank you very much.